Mrs. Davidson was talking to us about Helen being captured. Do you guys remember that? How Helen? No? Okay, well, I'll remind you. So there were these bad guys, these rebel lion warriors who had taken over the area where Helen was living and ministering. Do you guys remember these guys? Yeah? Okay, and they had just come into Helen's home, and they had beat her up really badly. And then they had taken her in their car, but in God's kindness, they brought her back, didn't they? Yes, they brought her back. So Helen was back in her village, but because that was such a sad and dangerous thing, the mission leaders at Ibambi, where she was originally from, they said, things are too dangerous, and we don't want you to be in Nebobongo anymore. We want all of the missionaries back at Ibambi so we can make sure you guys are safe. So that's what she did. She came back with the other missionaries. But that meant that Nebobongo, where she had been, well, they didn't have any doctors. They had this great medical center, and her good friend John that had helped her and served with her for a long time now, he ran the medical center, but he lost all his doctors. And John was also quickly losing supplies. He was running out of supplies, and partly because the rebels, anytime John unlocked the door to the pharmacy or storeroom, they would push right in past him, and they would take whatever they wanted. And that was really bad news, because that meant that if someone was really sick or injured and needed medicine or bandages, well, they were going to all run out if these rebels kept taking them. And so John had to come up with a way to save the supplies. And so God gave him a great idea. And what John was able to do is, in the middle of the night, when everybody else was sleeping, John crept over to the pharmacy and opened the door. And he got all the supplies together and laid them out. Bandages and medicines and thermometers, everything that people would need. And he put them into 10 groups. And then he took each group and he put it into a little bundle, and then put that bundle into a small box. And then, still in the middle of the night, he took those boxes and he found 10 different men in the village that he trusted. And he would knock on their door, and when they opened the door in the middle of the night, he would hand them a box. And he would say, I need you to go and bury this box for me outside, and then cover it up and forget all about it. And he wouldn't tell them what was in the box, because he wanted to protect them in case the rebels came and asked, what did you hide? They would be able to say, I don't know. And so then, every time John got low on supplies, what he would do is he would go back to one of these men, and he would knock on their door again and say, now it's time, I need my box back. And so his supplies in those boxes, they'd last about 6 weeks, each box worth of supplies. So he was able to really stretch out the supplies with this plan that God had given him. Now, while all this was happening at Nebobongo, back in Ibambi, Helen is having to heal, right? When you guys fall down and get hurt, does it take a little while to heal? Yeah. Sometimes you get scabs that need to heal. Sometimes you might fall down and hurt your arm, and then it's sore for a little while, you know? Well, Helen, she had been hurt real bad. And so her body was sore, and it needed to heal. And so she was resting and getting better, but she also had to make sure that her mind was right, that she was thinking rightly about what God was doing in her life. Do you remember Mrs. Davidson said that Helen would ask herself not, is this worth it, but is God worthy? And so she kept having to think those kind of thoughts, and she would think about a verse from the Bible that some man had given to her to think about right when she got saved. And that verse said, that I may know him, meaning Jesus, and the power of his resurrection, and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. That man had told her it was a privilege, it was a good gift if she suffered for Jesus someday. And that's what she was doing. Because when Helen got attacked, was she serving the Lord? Guys, was she serving the Lord in the Congo? Yes. And so she was suffering for God. And then she would also think about this passage of scripture from 1 Peter. It says, for what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? That means if I do something bad, like if I'm speeding down the road and I get a ticket for it and I pay my ticket, well, I don't get a prize for that, right? I'm just doing what needed to be done because I broke the law. So it's not that big of a deal. You don't get a prize, okay, if you do something bad and you receive a consequence for it. That's just normal life. But it says, but if you, when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. Guys, Jesus, did he ever do anything wrong? No, never. And did Jesus suffer? Yes, more than we ever will. And so Helen saw that to do good for God and suffer, she was following Jesus' example, and that was good. And she had a friend at the WEC tell her one time that a courageous man is not one who does not know fear, but one who, knowing fear, overcomes it. Raise your hand if you've ever been afraid. I have been afraid. Many times in my life, I have been afraid. This man was telling her that you can't be brave and you can't have courage unless you are afraid. To do something that you're not afraid of, well, that could be great, but it doesn't mean you're brave. You are brave when you are afraid of something, but you do it because you know it's a good thing to do. Okay, so these were all these things that Helen was thinking about and remembering as she was healing, okay? And then what happened was, at that time, the African leaders, we'll call them the good guys, the actual African government, they were doing good things. They were almost able to take over control and get rid of all those rebel leaders. But the problem was, the closer they got to victory, the more angry the rebel lions got. And they said, every white person here is a prisoner of war. And missionaries, you better be ready to go at any time. Pack a suitcase and pack a briefcase and be ready, because we can relocate you anytime we want. And then on November 24th, that's what happened. They said, all right, get your stuff. They let them also bring a cushion and a blanket, and they said, it's time to go. And they packed them all up in a truck. And it was piled high with all kinds of other people already in it. There were 24 African men. There were 4 African women. There was all of their stuff. There was 2 goats. There was a chicken. There was this big old tub of palm fat, which they used to cook with. There was bunches of bananas. And then the 7 missionaries and their stuff was in the truck too. And you guys, Helen, she had to sit on the top of a bunch of stuff. So she actually had to hold on for dear life to one of the rebel lions. Because even though she didn't like the lions, she was so afraid, because every time the truck moved like this, she was going to fall right off the top of the truck. And then in the back of the truck, one of the rebel lions was holding a hand grenade. It's like a little bomb in his hands. And he was ready to throw it at any Jeep that came by that tried to stop them. So guys, remember we talked about courage? Did Helen need courage? Yes, because this was scary, and she needed to trust in God, which she was practicing doing over and over and over again. Now, this Jeep ended up taking them to a Roman Catholic convent that would have looked something like this. A convent is a place where nuns and priests live. Okay, so when they got there, they had 2 boy missionaries, and they were sent off to the priest's headquarters. And then there were the 5 women missionaries, and they were put in a tiny room with some other nuns and some women and their children, and they were all crammed into this tiny room. And they were told, you're going to stay here, and in the morning, we're going to search through all your baggage and make sure you don't have anything you're not supposed to have. Now, that news was a little unsettling to Helen and the other missionaries, because they actually did have something in their baggage that would make the rebels angry. They had something called the Union Jack, which is the flag. You know, have you seen our American flag? Yeah, so this was the flag of the British Isles where they were from. And they knew that if the rebels found this flag, and it wasn't the rebel flag, they would be angry. So they stayed up that night, and they took tiny little nail scissors, and they snip, 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 snip. They cut that flag into tiny little strips. as long as it took them. And they'd have to stop every time the lions were close by because they didn't want them to hear the squeaking of the scissors. And so what they did is they took one of their cushions and they opened up a seam in the side and they took all the pieces of that flag and shoved it in the cushion and then sewed it back up to protect themselves. God kept giving them wisdom to know how to stay safe. Now, if you guys have been paying attention, you might know that Helen Roosevelt, she's got a lot of energy. Right? Remember all that energy she had as a kid even? Climbing out of windows and sliding down poles. And all that energy that God gave her is what kept her really useful as a doctor because she was so busy all the time. And now she still had all this energy. What was she going to do with it? Well, God used Helen in great ways while they were at the convent. She organized all the women who were there into certain teams so that they could share the chores in the house. And then the convent had like a library of French books, and she would spend lots of time reading those French books. And as time went by, it was getting closer and closer to Christmas. So they were taken on November 24th, which is close to like our Thanksgiving time. So it had been almost a month now. It was getting close to Christmas, and Helen thought, surely, God, you will rescue us by Christmas. But you know what? They weren't rescued by Christmas. They ended up celebrating Christmas there as prisoners at the convent. But is God always good? Yes, he is. And God provided 2 turkeys for them and some cakes and jellies, and they came together and they sang a hymn together. And even though they were prisoners in a scary place, they celebrated Christmas and they worshiped the Lord there. Now, 3 days later, on December 28th, more bad news. Suddenly, they were told that they were going to be taken in groups to an isolated roadhouse a ways away. So it might have looked something like this, just kind of a random house, okay, that was empty. And so they were taken in truckloads there. Now, more and more, the lions of these local places were getting more and more angry, and they hated any white person so much they said that all the white people should be killed. And so the people that were guarding Helen and the others, they had to protect them from these other lions that wanted to kill them. And so Helen and the others, they got to this roadhouse, and they for 2 days were cramped inside, hiding behind the biggest pieces of furniture that they could find, just to protect themselves from any bullets coming in or people coming in, to lions coming in to try to hurt them. And one day, the whole house was surrounded by lions, and they had weapons of all kinds in their hands, and they were getting closer and closer to the house, wanting to kill Helen and her other missionaries inside, when suddenly they heard machine gun firing going off in the distance. But this time, it was the good guys. They had been saved. They had been rescued, and just in time. So the good guys, the African army, came in and rescued them and took them back to the African army headquarters, where they got to take a bath, where they were served a wonderful meal, and where they just got to rest. And then by New Year's Day, Helen was safely on her way back home to the British Isles. Now, after being back in England for about a year, Helen found out that it was safe to return if she wanted to. They even said that the women should be safe to come back. The African army had been firmly in place for a year, but she had a lot to consider, you guys. She knew that if she ever went back, there was still a risk that she could be in that same situation again. It could still happen again, and that was a danger for her. She also thought, well, maybe God was done with her in the Congo. She had been there 11 years at this point. That's longer than you've been alive 2 times over, right? And so she thought, maybe I'm done. And then she wondered, well, do the people of the Congo want me back? Maybe they're happy that we're not there anymore, and they want to do things by themselves. Maybe they like it better that way. But then Helen started getting letters in the mail. Do you like to get letters in the mail? Me too. I love it. And so she started getting letters from these people in Nebo Bongo that loved her and they were asking her to come back. And her sweet friend John, he wrote in a letter, "We don't really expect you to come back after all you suffered for our people. But if God should persuade you to, we will never cease to thank him and to love you and care for you as never before." And so Helen was overjoyed because really she wanted to go back so badly. And this really affirmed for her that God had opened the door for her to go back. And so she did return. And when she got there, guys, hundreds of African Christians came out of the church singing and celebrating and welcoming her. And she was able to bring them so many medical supplies. And she started working as their doctor again, taking care of them for a few days. But soon Helen realized, even though she loved the people of Nebobongo so much, God was giving her a chance to do the thing that she had been wanting and dreaming about doing for years. And that was the ability to train other Africans to become nurses and to care for the bodies and evangelize by caring for the souls of the African people. So she had a chance to travel 350 miles away, which is like going to a whole nother state. If you're from California, it's like you're going back to California, right? She traveled, and she didn't have an airplane, okay? So she traveled a long way to meet up with an American missionary doctor who was building a great big medical facility, and he said, "Helen, I want you to run the nurse training center and to raise up nurses who can act like doctors in their villages and care for the people." So she went back to Ibambi and talked to the missionary leaders there, and they were so sad to see her go, but they were excited, and they knew that God was giving her this new opportunity. So they said, "Yes, we give you our full blessing to go and do this." And so Helen moved on, and she was now going to be a part of this training center. And so tomorrow, you guys are going to get to hear all about the training center and Helen's work there.